Hi, this is mine and Richard's presentation over the Chernobyl disaster for Dr. Hoke's environmental toxicology class. I'm Justice Pivoto, and Richard's here on a Zoom call.
Richard
Yeah,
Guy.
yeah, with our COVID setup here. All right, so overview. We'll go over a little bit of Chernobyl's history, details about the reactor, what they did to mitigate this disaster, some of the human and environmental impacts, aftermath, long-term effects, and what they're still working on today. So a little bit of the history. Chernobyl was an RBMK nuclear reactor in the Ukrainian SSR in the USSR. So this was a specific type of Soviet reactor. They built several of these, so it's lucky that only one of them broke down like this because there were some flaws in it that we'll be covering later. So construction began in the 1970s, and in the 70s they had, I think near the late 70s, they had two reactors, and by 1983 there were four, with two more planned on the way. So they were actually going to expand this a little bit before the incident happened. So on that fateful day, Saturday, April 26th, 1986, Chernobyl was the site of the worst nuclear accident in history. It killed many people and still affects a lot of people in Eastern Europe today. It's up there. So Fukushima, by the way, just a little side note, is also pretty bad. There's some rating system, and I think Fukushima also reached around the same level as Chernobyl, but Chernobyl was a lot worse in its long-term effects and fatalities. So in 1995, the Ukrainian government estimated that around 125,000 people could have died from the radiation's effects. We found a lot of different sources. I saw one that estimated even up to 200,000, and some that say only a few thousand. So we can only really know some that are direct effects, and some cancers all throughout Europe could be linked back to this, but we'll never really know the true human cost. So some estimates say that directly this cost, the disaster cost $125 billion to $250 billion in direct costs. So building the sarcophagus, which is this big concrete slab over the reactor, and the new, not even to mention the new arch that they built over it, cost a lot of money, and that's just direct costs. Indirect economic impact. Belarus had a planned nuclear power program to go ahead, but after this they just canceled it. So they could have had a lot of, you know, economic benefit from that. So indirect cost, huge. Ukraine and Belarus are actually still paying for this, and people are still suffering today. Somewhere around 5 to 7% of the Ukrainian government's annual budget is still spent on related benefit programs linked to Chernobyl. And as you can see on this map, a little north of the old town of Chernobyl, there is Pripyat. That was like a workers' town that we'll be talking about later. So I'll be talking a little bit about the reactor itself, and then Richard's going to go into what exactly went wrong. So the reactor design was a little bit flawed, you could say. It was made a little bit cheaply. It was kind of incentivized to be so in Soviet Russia. So it used as the moderator graphite, which was a little bit cheaper of a material and contributed to the breakdown. So they used slightly enriched uranium, which is 2% uranium-235, as the fuel. They bombarded it with neutrons, and that started the reaction. It's kind of how this worked. And then the steam from the water coolant helped power a turbine, which went kind of back into the reaction here. So this is just the basic design, and now Richard's going to go into a little more detail here.
Okay, so the design of the safety test was to take the dying turbines and for them to turn the diesel generators in the meantime of the 60 seconds that in the event of like a power outage or natural disaster that the reactor core was going to be able to maintain itself. And they had the reactor core at half capacity earlier in the day prior to the explosion, and they were prepping for the event to do the safety test. And what ended up happening was they needed more power, just kind of like in the ice storm, we needed more power. So they told them, hey, we need to have more power. So they sustained at half capacity instead of proceeding further with the test. And they're like, okay, we'll do it with the night crew and we'll get this done. And so they didn't know that during that time they were basically crippling and poisoning the core with xenon, which stops a nuclear reaction from going further. And so they had the test at night, and again, the crew didn't really know what they were doing. And so they started lowering the reactor core, and it plummeted. And they couldn't get it back up. And the guy that was in charge was like, hey, you need to get that back up. We don't really have any options. I want to proceed with the test. And so they pulled out 205 of the 211 control rods that basically stop the reaction from proceeding to go forwards. And then they started the safety test afterwards. They had minimal power, but they didn't have the actual necessary requirements for the safety test. And so the turbines really weren't spinning. And so the water really wasn't moving. And well, the water turned into steam and the reactor core started to heat up. The xenon inside the reactor core started to dissipate, and it was no longer keeping the reactor core in check. And unfortunately, they did try to stop it once the power started to surge, and the reactor has every single reactor has some kind of mechanism to stop a failsafe to stop the reaction. So they press that failsafe button, which drops all the control rods into the reactor core. Unknowing to them or not, they were made out of graphite, which graphite acts as a moderator for the reactor core. In other reactor cores, they use heavy water on the outside. They take low grade uranium, which is like 2%, as stated earlier. They take 2% because they don't want a nuclear bomb, and they goes and bounces off the heavy water, and it comes back and it is able to facilitate a reaction, and then the water will evaporate. Once the water evaporates, that reaction stops, and then you're able to flow more water into that reaction. That's how typical reactors worked. But the Soviet reactors, they used graphite tips as a moderator, and they used regular water, which did not act as a moderator. It absorbed neutrons. That was one of the balances of their system. And so they basically took the boron tips, which was the brakes, and the water, and they had all the xenon in the core burnt. So everything that stopped the reaction from proceeding to go forwards was gone. And so the more steam that it made, the more reaction that it made, and it burst all the pipes that was inside the reactor core. And so they stuck the graphite tips inside the reactor core, and graphite acts as a moderator. Like the heavy water, it's what's bouncing the neutrons in this low grade uranium to make it effective to actually stop it to have a sufficient reaction inside of a containment. And the graphite reacted and the water's gone, and it just blew the lid off of the reactor core about 30 meters into the air. Okay, now we're going to be talking about some of the disastrous aftermath that actually happened after the plant explosion. About 350,000 people were evacuated from the areas, which was not as much at the beginning, but they eventually moved a whole bunch of people out. Um, there was about 600,000 liquidators, which these were people who basically went and cleaned up a lot of the stuff and the debris from the reactor core. Some of the first initial people who received most of the radiation dose was the firefighters, which most of them died within a month. And they did get the fires to subside early in the morning. However, the actual building of the reactor core just burned for days. There was a plant that was 50 miles away from the actual reactor, and women were working in a textile factory, and they had received different pelts and different things and wool from the different animals and stuff from that region, and they received about as much radiation as an annual dose within about an hour. Um, and of those people, there was 288 who were working there, there's only 10 of them left who basically didn't get sick for, radiation poisoning or some other type of reaction. Also, they poured about 15,000 tons of different materials on the reactor core, on the open reactor core, preceding the days after the reaction. And they basically tried to make it to where it didn't go into the air, and they poured a whole bunch of boron and sand and other different materials, as you can see there. The sarcophagus, which was made about 2-3 weeks after the thing, was a temporary structure that was made to last about 30 years or so. It was 90,000 people actually constructed it, which they're part of the liquidators. And it was basically just this basic concrete structure that they tried to build as best as they could at the things that they had. Um, they did try to use different means to build the sarcophagus, um, like different robots that they had tried to get from the Germans, and they stopped working. And so a lot of the things that they had to do was that they had to use a lot of human, they called biomachines, to build a lot of these facilities. And it really wasn't airtight, and there wasn't really anything that was great about the structure except for it just kept most of the stuff away from getting into the atmosphere. There was a group of miners who were also trying to build a tunnel underneath just in case that the nuclear meltdown had occurred and that the stuff had gotten into the ground table, but that actually didn't happen, and luckily all that was decent. Uh, but all in all, there was about 30% of the total mass of the reactor core that is missing. There was 200 megatons of metric tons of material in the reactor core, but only about 70% of it actually still remains. And so a lot of it scattered throughout, as well as this robot graveyard of different things that they had that, I mean, honestly didn't work out for them. In total, about 200,000 square kilometers of surrounding area was basically radioactive and inhabitable.
Okay, now I'm going to be going into health and environmental effects. So, thousands of people died from radiation poisoning and cancer. Like we said earlier, the estimations vary wildly. We won't really ever know the true human cost, but it was staggering and horrible. At the time, and even today, thyroid cancer, leukemia, and respiratory illnesses are pretty common in the area, and those are the main ones caused by this radiation. The topsoil is still irradiated, which still affects invertebrate populations in the area, and mutant animals are pretty common. So the energy from radiation damages or breaks down DNA molecules and causes mutations. Especially if there's a gamete that is irradiated, that can result in death of the gamete, so no embryo, or cause birth effects like in the picture on the right. In 1990, there were around 400 recorded deformed animals, and most died shortly after birth. So there's an exclusion zone around the old plant. It's about 1,600 square miles, and it's kind of a wildlife sanctuary, weirdly enough, despite being radioactive. Some people are saying, well, some people will say they're actually more protected with the radiation than if humans were still there, weirdly enough. So many vertebrates live well, and even though they're irradiated and some are slightly mutated, their population levels are sometimes even better thought than before the plant exploded. And invertebrate populations, however, are almost non-existent, which I thought was curious. So butterflies and I guess roaches and stuff like that, not there because they lay their eggs in the topsoil, which is still pretty irradiated. So no invertebrates. Pretty strange ecosystem. But yeah, so the wildlife is actually almost kind of better off. Yeah, this was a horrible disaster is still in effect. They built a new arch over it in I think 2011. That cost billions and billions of dollars, and we're still dealing with this today. And here's some of our sources. Thank you.